Welcome, welcome. Man, all right, let's settle in. This is episode 2 of our covenant theology. Last time we talked about the concept of covenant just in general. And so in this session, we're going to actually tackle something that, I don't know, maybe potentially a little bit controversial. We'll see. You determine. You're the student. We're learning together. So today, I really want to get into session 2, the covenant of creation. Now, I know that some of you might be thinking, wait a second, Mike. I've read Genesis 1, 2, and 3, the whole creation account, and I don't see the word covenant anywhere. And I made a big deal about that last episode as far as covenant examples. And so, is this just me maybe reading something into the text that isn't there? Well, I think that's a fair question. And I think you should ask that question. And it's one that, quite honestly, some of the greatest theologians have wrestled with this exact question. In fact, for example, John Murray, which is a brilliant Presbyterian theologian, he actually preferred to talk about this particular covenant as the Adamic administration rather than the covenant with Adam. And of course, as you dialogue with him and you read his stuff, his reasoning, well, he believed that covenants are always about redemption, about fixing things after sin had entered the picture. And so, since Adam and Eve were sinless when they were created, well, Murray tends to think, he argues anyways, that the idea of covenant in his perspective doesn't quite fit. It doesn't match. It doesn't make sense to him. So why are we even talking about covenant of creation? Why is this episode? We're going to spend 45 minutes on this thing and the word isn't actually used. Well, why do some scholars use other terms? I've heard covenant of life, covenant of nature, covenant of works is maybe something that you might be familiar with. And those have all been used to describe this relationship between Adam and Eve specifically. Well, here's the thing. As we dialogue with the covenant of creation, here's the thing. The idea of covenant can be presented even if the word itself isn't there. Now, I like the term covenant of creation. That's the way I prefer to dialogue about this because it helps us see the bigger picture of redemption, the redemption history. And so God starts things off with creation. He's going to bring it all to completion with the new creation. And the old creation, in a way, I would argue, anticipates, well, points forward towards this new thing, this new creation. And so, well, honestly, if I'm being very transparent, the specific word that we use, this covenant terminology, isn't the most important thing. The most important question that I want to ask all of us is, what was the nature of God's relationship with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? What was the relationship like? Now, I'm going to argue that we can legitimately understand God's relationship with Adam and Eve as a covenant. I think that is an important thing to begin to understand, even though the word isn't there, and even though it's not explicitly used. And I don't think words have to explicitly be used in order for the concept to be present. So here's the thing. First and foremost, the word isn't everything. And I think that's important. Just because the word covenant isn't there doesn't mean the concept of covenant is absent. Think about it. If you turn to 2 Samuel 7, for example, and First Chronicles 17, God makes a huge promise to David about his dynasty. But the word covenant, it isn't used to describe that promise in that specific passage. However, if you continue to look at later biblical writers, um, they do prefer, uh, they refer to God's promise actually with regards to David and the covenant in that manner. In fact, let's just do this. Let's actually see what the text actually says. So let's go to let's actually work into Psalm 89 verse 3. So here, what do we have? Again, the passage in 2 Samuel and the corollary passage in First Chronicles 17 um, does not refer to the passage as a covenant. But what does it say in Psalm 89 verse 3? You have said, I made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to David by name. So it's very, very clear. Okay. And you can look at, even if we scroll down to verse 28, let's do that real quick. We look at verse 28. My steadfast love I will keep for him forever, and my covenant will stand firm for him. It's in verse 34. It's in verse 39. It's in Psalm 132, verse 12. In fact, it's even outside of the Psalter. If you go to Jeremiah 33:21, what do we have? Then also my covenant with David, my servant, may be broken, so that he shall not have a son to reign on his throne. And my covenant with the Levitical priests, my ministers. So my point is that the word covenant, as it gets described in 2 Samuel chapter 7, when this whole thing is established, it doesn't use the actual word. The word isn't everything. You don't have to have the word in order there and present in order for the concept to be present. Now, the second thing I want to point out, Hosea's hint, and he's going to hint at this in Hosea chapter 6, verse 7. And I'm going to get this on the screen in just a second, but we actually do have some textual evidence for a covenant at creation. I want to show this to you. Hosea chapter 6, verse 7. What does it say? But like Adam, they transgressed the covenant. There they dealt faithlessly with me. So notice now, some people argue about what this verse actually means, and some say that there, the word there they dealt faithlessly with me. Some will argue that that verse refers to a place called Adam that's mentioned in Joshua 3:16. But that doesn't really make sense in the context of Hosea, who's talking about Israel's sin. It makes much more sense to see this as a reference to Adam the person. And Hosea is saying that Israel, like Adam, broke the covenant God made with them. This is huge, because God himself is describing his relationship with Adam as a covenant. It's basically like he's saying Adam was like the first draft, and Israel was supposed to be a new and improved version of that draft, but they messed up the covenant just like he did. Okay. The next thing I want to point out is that the elements were all there. Even if we didn't have Hosea chapter 6, verse 7, even if we took that out of the picture, we could still make a very strong case for a covenant of creation because all the essential elements of the covenant are present. What elements am I talking about? Well, first of all, there needed to be two parties. So, what are the two parties? Well, there's God and there's Adam and Eve. Those are the two parties. There needs to be stipulations. What are the stipulations? Well, we see in Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, along with chapter 3, verse 3 and 11, God gave them a command: don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Thirdly, there has to be blessings and curses that go kind of apart with this whole covenant agreement. And there were consequences for obedience, which would be the blessing, life with God, and disobedience, which would be death. We see that in Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, and also chapter 3, verse 3. The fourth one is there has to be conditionality. These are the four different kind of parts of this covenant relationship. And we see this, the whole thing, this whole arrangement, this promise that was made was conditional. If they obeyed, they would live. If they disobeyed, they would die. Now, how long was this covenant supposed to last? Well, that's a matter of speculation. We don't know. Was it meant to be a temporary test, or was it meant to be a forever thing? The Bible just doesn't explicitly say. So here's the fourth thing I want to mention. Redemption, as it relates to a covenant, redemption isn't required. You don't have to have the relationship tied strictly to redemption in order for a covenant to take place. And some will argue that covenants only exist in redemptive situations. In fact, that was Murray that I said in the beginning, the famous Presbyterian author. He would argue this, but that's just not true. That's not what the text says. We see all sorts of covenants in the Bible that have absolutely nothing to do with redemption. Let's look at a very good example. And in fact, I think it's a great example. Let's look at marriage. This is so you will be delivered from the forbidden woman and the adulteress with her smooth words, who forsakes the companion of her youth. But what happens? And forgets the covenant of her God. If you look at Malachi, just to give you further context for this marriage relationship, Malachi chapter 2, verse 14. But you say, why does he not? Because the Lord has witnessed before you and the wife of your youth to whom you have been faithless, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. So it doesn't have to have redemption tied to it in order for there to be a covenant relationship. But it's not, and I say that because it's not primarily about fixing a problem caused by sin. The same goes with other covenants. You have the covenant between Jacob and Laban in Genesis 31, the latter part of chapter 31. You have a covenant relationship between David and Jonathan in 1 Samuel 18 and chapter 20 and chapter 22 and 23. All of that lays out that relationship that they had, and there was a covenant between the two of them. We looked at this in the first section, Israel and the Gibeonites, Joshua chapter 9, the first 27 verses. Solomon and Hiram of Tyre in 1 Kings 5:12. These are all examples of covenantal relationships that don't deal exclusively with redemption. And so redemption isn't required in order for there to be a covenantal concept in the passage. Now, the fifth thing that I think draws a very strong parallel here is the Adam and Christ parallel. Many of you will be familiar with this in Romans chapter 5, starting in verse 12. The parallels between Adam and Christ is significant. We see this in well, let's just read through some of this. And I know that it's several verses here. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and to death spread to all men because all sin, for sin indeed was in the world before the law was given. There's a nice connection. Um, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even though those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type for the one who was to come. For the free gift is not like the trespass. For if many die through one man's trespass, much more have the grace of God and the free gift by the grace of that one man, Jesus Christ. So there is a parallel here between Adam, the first Adam, and Christ, called the second Adam. Now we see this also in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 21 and 22. For as by a man came death, by a man also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. So here's my point. Both Adam and Christ acted as representatives. Adam represented all of humanity, and his sin brought sin and death and condemnation to everyone connected to him, and we are all connected to him. All have sinned. Jesus, which is the last Adam, represents all those who are united to him, and he brings grace, righteousness, eternal life. The fact that Adam had this covenantal and representative or representational role is a clue to the covenantal relationship in the creation account. All right, so let's look at one other area. What about Noah? Noah is a covenant. Is it a covenant renewal? Now, here's an interesting point. God established his covenant with Noah in Genesis 6:18. All right, let's just go there real quick. Genesis 6:18, but I will establish my covenant with you, speaking about Noah, and you shall come into the ark, you and your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And you can see later on, chapter 9, verse 9 and 11 and 17. That's the context for establishment of this covenant, okay? So God established his covenant with Noah rather than cut it. Now, some scholars, and there's a reason why I'm using that language, okay? Some scholars argue that establishing a covenant usually refers to renewing a covenant that already existed, while cut a covenant means starting something completely new. Now, there are exceptions to this rule, okay? If you want to do a little further study, Deuteronomy 29, verse 1. Again, we'll get this on the screen here if I can type properly. Deuteronomy 29, verse 1. These are the words of the covenant that the Lord commanded to make with the people of Israel in the land, besides the covenant that he had made with them at Horeb. So we should here's where my point is, okay? You can actually look at, so this is an example, and then also Ezekiel 16 and then 60. And you can see this in 60 and 62. I will remember my covenant with you in the days of your youth. I will establish for you an everlasting covenant. I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So here's where let me kind of reiterate what I'm saying. Okay. There's exceptions to what I'm about to share. And so some will argue that there is a phrase called establish a covenant. And that is when that gets used, that means there's a renewal of a covenant. And when the phrase cut a covenant, that means starting a new covenant. Now, I showed you two examples, okay, where there are exceptions to that rule. So we shouldn't rely solely on that argument. We have to be careful when we deal in absolutes. But it does raise the possibility that the Noahic covenant was a renewal of the covenant with Adam. There is that possibility, but we can't just force that onto the text, is where I'm going. Okay, so we have we've looked at a couple of things. Now I want to go back to well, let's talk about this real quick. Why can we talk about a covenant at creation? That's kind of what we've been working through, okay? And so I think we've established why. We've laid out I've given you at least 6 things to kind of process to help you kind of move into that kind of argument. Now, my next question is, or my next kind of processing thought is this concept of being created in God's image. And this is, to me, and this is really important because this concept is way more than just a pretty image. Like, oh, it's nice that we're made in the image of God. Isn't that nice? Okay. We have to think intelligently about what this means. And we have to be careful not to let that serpent in. We got to be careful. Don't let that serpent in. When we're talking about image, let's handle the text well. So let's pay attention. Okay. So God created Adam and Eve and placed them in this amazing garden where they could hang out, they could interact, they could be involved with God. But there's something even more profound. God made them in what? Well, in his image, right? And I'm not going to I don't want to belabor this point too much, but there are several things that I think are important. Okay. What does it mean in verse 26 where it says a couple of things? Let us, this is plural. Okay. A couple things to pay attention to. The word God is Elohim. Okay. This is let us. Now, I'm not going to, this is a plural form. Let us make man in our plural form after our likeness. Now, I want you to pay attention to these two words. We're going to talk about these. Salem and damut, which is likeness. So let us, there's a plurality there. I'm not going to dive into that debate because some think this is a connection to the Trinity. I don't think it is. I think that would be a poor exegesis of the text. But there is a plurality of God in this context. And it says, let us make man in our image after our likeness. So image and likeness are connected in some way. And let them have dominion. And then later on, what does he says? So God created man in singular, his own image. Okay. So scholars have actually, this is a fascinating text. It's incredibly fascinating. And scholars have debated about this for centuries. They're still continuing to debate about this. And we don't have all the time to go through all the details. Maybe at another time, I'll do an entire kind of exegesis of this and work through. I'm going to give you a couple of key things to think through, some key ideas that correlate to the conversation around covenants. Okay, the covenant at creation correlated to the image. Now, the two words image and likeness. So this is selem and demut in the Hebrew. The words image and likeness are probably synonyms, probably. In the ancient world, kings would set up statues. They would set up images to represent their rule over a territory. So you can think of, and I'm going to give you again a couple of things to think through. You can think of this as a statue that represented God. Um, I'll leave it at that, okay, for now. The second thing I want you to work through is this idea of ruling the world. Okay, if you pay attention in Genesis, in fact, we can bring this back on the screen. You'll notice, just pay attention. Genesis emphasizes that Adam and Eve were created to what? To have dominion, to rule. Okay, so this is rulership over the world, to have dominion over it. In fact, later on, I've already got them highlighted. They are called to subdue it and have rulership over it. Okay, so they're supposed to have dominion over the fish, over the birds, over the livestock, over everything else on the earth. They were God's vice regents. They were rulers, they were managers. They were designed to take care of the world that's under their authority. Okay, so there is this concept of rulership, ruling the world. Now, the third thing I want you to think of is sonship. Okay, sonship. And where we're going to go for this is Genesis chapter 5, verse 3. Okay. There is a close connection between between someone being made in God's image and being his son. We see this because this word likeness and image gets used again. These are the same words. This is demut and salim or salem, where it says when Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. Okay, so this is an important clue, right? Genesis 5:3 says that Seth was in Adam's image because he was Adam's son. Now, similarly, if you look at Egypt, okay, the king was considered to be in the image of God because he was believed in Egyptology, he was believed to be the son of little g God, the son of their God. Okay. Adam is also called the son of God. Don't believe me? Well, let's look at Luke 3:38. It says this: the son of Enos, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. Well, that's interesting. All right, this is all about sonship. This means that Adam and Eve were supposed to exercise their rule as God's children in fellowship with him. They were supposed to be co-rulers, to rule. Their rulership wasn't independent of God. It was meant to be carried out in his presence and for his glory. I want to walk us to 1 Corinthians 11, verse 7, because this is what Paul brings up. 1 Corinthians 11:7. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory. The image and glory. So being in the image is something about the glory of God. Okay, but woman is the glory of man. Now, that is a fascinating passage. Another one that I can't get into because it has a whole lot of cool stuff to talk about. But I want you to see the connection between image and glory that is brought up by Paul. So they were supposed to represent God. Adam and Eve reflected his character, just like good sons bring glory to their parents by living righteous lives. And Adam and Eve they were supposed to do the same thing, bring glory to God by living in accordance with God's character. Now, before I get out of this section, I really want to share with you. I have mentioned multiple times before the impact that Dr. Michael Heiser has had on my own journey. And so I feel like it would be almost a miss if I didn't mention, since we're talking about the image of God, if I didn't mention Dr. Michael Heiser's perspective on the image, because I have found a massive amount of value in seeing kind of what Heiser puts forward. Now, he's got a very unique and insightful perspective here. According to Heiser, the image of God in Genesis, okay, it isn't primarily about how we look. It isn't about specific abilities that we have. Instead, and there's reasons for that, okay? Instead, it's about our status and our calling. In fact, he calls it our function as created beings. And what he points out is that in the ancient Near East, kings would often be described as the image of a god. In fact, little side note here. I think this is fascinating connections here. So, an idol is considered something that's made in the image of the god. And that thing is supposed to represent God. Okay, and so humans are God's idols. It's one of the reasons why we are not supposed to worship other idols, other humans, but we are supposed to worship our Creator. So it's a way of this image of the God that you represent is a way of showing that this person was the official representative, a vice regent. We already talked a little bit about that, carrying out God's authority on earth. But what's so remarkable about the Genesis account is that it extends this royal status to all humanity, not just kings or a select few. It isn't just a certain hierarchy, right, or a certain race or a certain nationality or a certain gender. Every human being, and this is what's incredible, whether they are made with certain defects or certain disabilities or certain whatever it might be, all humans, all have the image of God. So, what does it actually mean? And this is the important question. What does it actually mean to be in the image of God? Well, Heiser points out that to image God, is to serve as God's representative, his steward on earth. It's the function. Okay, it's our function as humans. It's not something we have, but rather something we are. We are imagers. And in his own words, he says this: to be human is to image God. It's about our role. It's our vocation, reflecting God's character, stewarding his creation wisely, and participating in God's community and the administration of it. Now, I do want to say this because Heiser derives this understanding. That sounds nice, but I always ask, well, where did you get it from? Like, I want to know from the text, how did you conclude this? And so I just want to mention that his understanding of the image of God, which is Salem Elohim, directly from the Hebrew text. He takes it from the text by examining the language. Now, if you want to know kind of where this is, I will say this. You need to get this book, okay? The Unseen Realm. He talks about it in this particular book. I'll leave it up there again one more time. The Unseen Realm by Dr. Michael Heiser. He discusses this at great length in that particular book. But it's important to understand that he derives this understanding directly from the Hebrew text by examining the language and the ancient context of Genesis 1. And this is what he notes. He points out that the Hebrew word salem, which is image, and demut, which is likeness, Both of those Hebrew words indicate representation rather than physical form. So he points out that in ancient Near Eastern context, the phrase image of God, as we already mentioned before, it refers to kings as the visible representatives of a deity. And so in Genesis, however, this honor is not just put on one being. It's not just Adam is made. Okay. It's not just Adam, it's all humanity. Humanity is made in the image of God. This honor is extended to all humankind. Thus, the important part is from the Hebrew wording and its cultural backdrop. Heiser is going to conclude directly from the text, from the Hebrew linguistics in the text. It's emphasizing humanity's appointed role as God's representatives. They're his stewards, reflecting his authority and participating in his governance on earth. And this is why I often say that we are imagers. How well are you imaging God? Sometimes I do this well. Sometimes I don't do this very well. But I'm still made in the image of God, and my function is to reflect God. Okay, the other thing now, I want to move into the kind of the next context to the conversation. And that is that the image isn't erased. So it's important to understand that the image isn't taken away when sin comes in, it's marred. Even Adam and Eve sinned. They didn't completely lose the image of God, right? We see that in Genesis 5, verse 3. We see it in Genesis 9, 6. We even see it in the New Testament. James chapter 3, verse 9 make it very clear that all human beings are still made in the image of God. Even though sin has marred, it definitely has marred. And I want to just point this out because I really think that let's go to James 3 verse 9 just for context, okay? So look at what James says. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. So even in the New Testament we get this theology kind of coming through the text that the author of James says everyone is made in the image of God, all of humanity, okay? But what do we know to be very real? Well, sin did mar the image, okay? The full restoration of the image happens when we come to know God. In fact, Colossians 3:10 discusses that. Let's go back one verse. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. So full restoration happens of the image when we begin to know God, when we have knowledge of him, and we become righteous and holy. Check out Ephesians 4:24. Let's start back. Let's see. But that is not the way you learned Christ, assuming that you have heard about him and are taught in him as the truth is in Jesus, to put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. So when we are combined with Christ, when we are unified with Christ, it's to know God, and it is to be restored, to recreated in the likeness of God, which is how we obtain righteousness and holiness. So looking ahead in redemptive history, we see very clearly that human beings are restored to their original purpose when they are conformed to the image of God's Son. That's Romans 8:29. Only those who belong in Christ Jesus, the last Adam. Do you see the connection there, friends? The original first Adam marred the image. The last Adam is the restoration. Only that last Adam, Jesus Christ, are fully restored as sons and daughters of God if you are united with Christ. Believers are being transformed into the image of God, 2 Corinthians 3:18. And they will fully bear the image of Christ on the day of resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15:49. All right, well, let's keep moving into the next section that I want to talk about. And this is, we've already alluded to some of this. This is ruling as priest kings. This is a glimpse of heaven on earth, this combination of what we would call paradise, a restoration of the Eden story. So Adam and Eve were made in God's image to rule the world as his servants, as his imagers, as his sons. But there's more to this story. There's evidence that they were also supposed to function as priest kings. They were meant to mediate God's blessing to the world as the king and queen. And I don't know if you have thought of it this way, but Adam and Eve were the king and queen of God's creation. Think about this for a second. The Garden of Eden anticipates the tabernacle, which is Exodus 25-31. God's special residence in the garden. He resides in the garden, just like he will later reside or his dwelling place will be in the tabernacle. And then New Testament, we are the temple and God is in us, that imagery. So what made the garden so amazing was that God's presence with Adam and Eve. That's the whole thing. If God wasn't there, what's the big deal, right? It was a place where they enjoyed his fellowship, his love. They walked, they interacted, they engaged, they were one with God in the Garden of Eden. Now, I want to show you a couple of connections in the text. This is ruling as priest kings. Here are some connections between the garden and the tabernacle temple specifically. So we have God's special presence are in both. God was present in both the garden and the tabernacle. We also have the cherubim. Now, I've put the verses. You're welcome to take a screenshot of this afterwards or kind of pause the video and kind of look at. You'll see a bar in between right here. This bar is going to be the representation between, on the left-hand side is the garden. On the right-hand side is the tabernacle or the temple. And you can look at these passages for yourself in this study. So the cherubim guarded the garden. That's hard to say. And you also have cherubim who are present in the tabernacle itself. When we get to the entrance, okay, the entrance was from the east, both in the Garden of Eden. You entered from the east, and the tabernacle, also the entrance was from the east. The tree of life and the lampstand. So many of the branched lampstands in the tabernacle, they were seen as a symbolism to the tree of life or symbology for it, imagery for it. There was work and keep. Okay, both of these verbs are used in the text. In fact, Genesis 2:15 describes Adam's job in the garden with these verbs, work and keep. And they're also the same verbs that are used for the Levitical actions in the sanctuary. The next area of connection, we have rivers in both. In fact, a river flowed from Eden and watered the garden. We got Genesis 2:10 for that. There was also a river that flowed from Ezekiel's temple and made salt water fresh. Check it out in Ezekiel 47. There were also stones present. There were precious stones found in the Garden of Eden, gold and onyx. Side note, one of the reasons why I love Onyx Coffee Lab is because it reminds me of the garden. So where also there are special stones in the tabernacle as well. We see that in Exodus 25 with a couple of verses. And then what you'll find, and there's a ton of places you can see this, but what you'll find is with regards to the mountain, both the garden and the tabernacle were likely located either on or near a mountain, which is considered in ancient Near Eastern culture. Mountains were considered sacred lands. They were actually the place of the gods in the ancient Near Eastern understanding. So, really interesting. All of these suggest that Adam and Eve, these are the markers that would help you suggest or conclude that Adam and Eve were meant to be seen as priest kings in the garden, exercising God's rule, mediating his blessing to the world while depending on him because they're made in his image, right? They're modeling him. They're functioning as the representatives through their priest king role. Okay, we're getting close, but let's talk about one other thing. The test. This is a choice between God's way or our way. Now, however, Adam and Eve, they weren't supposed to exercise their rule autonomously in this creation account. They were always subject to God's will. God showed his goodness to them by placing them in this spectacular garden. And they were supposed to show their submission to God by doing what? By refusing to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's Genesis 2:17. And if they did that, they subjected to their own desires, what they had been asked not to do by God. If they ate the fruit, they would die. This is seen in the covenantal language. This would be the condition of the covenant. And the curse would be death if they broke it. So Adam and Eve were called to what? They were called to perfect obedience. Perfect obedience in the Garden of Eden. One failure caused the curse to occur. Partial obedience was not good enough in this covenantal relationship. One transgression would lead to death. But there was also a blessing that also occurred. There was a blessing for obedience. If Adam and Eve obeyed, what would happen? Well, you and I wouldn't be talking about this right now, right? They would enjoy life, the tree of life. Genesis 2, verse 9. You see it in Genesis chapter 3, 22 and 24. It foreshadowed the final joy that we see in Revelation 22, verse 2, in verse 14, verse 19, this tree of life that we see coming back into the picture in the eschatology of John. So it seems like Adam and Eve have, if Adam and Eve had passed the test, if they had actually lived in perfect obedience, God would have eventually confirmed them in righteousness. Now, we don't have evidence of that in the text because it doesn't explicitly say that, but that would be the conclusion. If they had obeyed, then there's more than likely some point in that relationship that they would have been confirmed as righteous. But what happened? The fall. This is the disaster that has universal consequences. So we know in the story that Adam and Eve disobeyed. And as a result of that disobedience, the curses of the covenant end up coming upon them. They experience death, same death that we have today. And that truly threatened everything about them. They were separated from fellowship with God. And the consequences weren't limited to Adam and Eve. We see in Romans chapter 5 and 1 Corinthians 15, it tells us that sin, death, and condemnation spread to all people. Why? Because of Adam's sin. This is why I have here the curse of the covenant had universal impact, universal consequences. Immediately after the fall, we see the devastating consequences of Adam's sin. Immediately, we have murder that enters the picture with Cain, where Cain kills Abel in Genesis 4, verse 6. Genesis 5 records the roll call of death, showing the impact of Adam's sin on every single generation. So by the time we get to Noah, and that's another covenant, by the time we get to Noah, sin has completely overwhelmed humanity. It's the proliferation of sin. Adam has unleashed, quite literally, the sin monster into the world. That would be a very deplorable picture if we didn't have the promise, if we didn't have some sort of promise, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. So even in the midst of this devastating situation, there is a glimmer of hope. We find this glimmer of hope in Genesis chapter 3, verse 5. We find this glimmer of hope that pops up. God says to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your heel, and you shall bruise his heel. This verse, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but this verse is actually often called the Protoevangelium. This is the first gospel, the first good news. This is a good thing. The enmity. I will put enmity. This is good. Now, this isn't directly related to the covenant with Adam. I'll grant you that. But Adam and Eve certainly didn't deserve mercy after breaking the covenant. What did they deserve? Death. That's it. But God promised that the offering of the woman would crush the head of the serpent, even though the serpent would bruise the heel. So this is where the serpent really comes into the picture in a way that really connects to the first good news. This promise was ultimately fulfilled when we look at Romans 16, verse 20. Let's check it out. Romans 16, verse 20. And God, the God of peace, will soon crush Satan under your feet. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you. So there is a connection to the fulfillment of this exact prophecy, eradicating the serpent from the picture. So as we close this down, do we have good reason for seeing a covenant at creation? I think so. I think I've presented enough evidence that we can see a covenant relationship between God and Adam and Eve at creation, even though the word covenant isn't explicitly used. The elements of covenant theology, covenant language, covenant relationship are present. We've talked about how Hosea 6:7, it supports the idea. But even if we take that out of the mix, all of the other things are present. Adam and Eve were made in God's image to rule the world on his behalf. They were supposed to be priest kings in God's creation, representing him as imagers, as his idols, his images to the world, representing him to all, displaying his righteousness and holiness. Their fall into sin plunged the human race into misery and death. That was the consequence. That was the curse. But then we look at the big picture. The big picture, the ultimate redemptive picture of covenants. the big picture of the Bible. And we see that Jesus Christ is the last Adam who brings righteousness and life to his people. You'll find that in Romans chapter 5, 12 to 19, 1 Corinthians 15, 21 and 22, which we looked at. Adam, who is a covenant head, brought misery and death into the world. But believers will reign in life. Romans 5:17. I want to look at that as we exit out of our conversation. Romans chapter 5, verse 17. Look at this beautiful text. For if, because of one man's trespass, death reigned through that one man, much more will those who receive the abundance of grace and the free gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ, the last Adam. What a beautiful picture. So as we exit out, I want everyone to understand that I believe we can see covenant relationship between God and Adam and Eve. Now, in the next segment, as we move to next week, next episode, we're going to be covering the next section, the covenant of Noah. I hope to see you there. God bless and keep safe.